our sponsors. And I have Cheryl here who would say a few words. Then I'll come in with the introduction and I'll tell you who I am, I promise.
Good morning and welcome to the last day of the conference. I'm Cheryl Doss and I'm the editor of Oxford Development Studies, which is the journal that's sponsoring this panel. We're really delighted to be able to do this. And I really want to encourage people. I've heard great papers over the last couple of days and encourage people to think about Oxford Development Studies as a place for publishing your work coming out of the conference. We're also very open to special issues. So if you've put together something and it would work really well as a special issue, feel free to be in touch with us about that too. So thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Publications, yes. Okay, so thank you very much, organizers, for inviting me to chair this session. I am not part of DSA, but I am DSA. An honorary member, and I was doing well. My name is Emmanuel Essa, the head of Department for Sustainable Energy, Environment and Engineering within the School of Built Environment. And looking at your team crisis, we contribute a lot to that at School of Built Environment. That's why I said I'm part of DSA. That's enough about me. We have a session that's supposed to start. I'll just take a brief minute to introduce our speaker for this session. But after her, we'll just pause, have remarks from another speaker whom I'll introduce briefly, then we'll take all the questions. So please stay awake, have the coffees out there, and let's keep sipping on as and when. So our speaker for this morning is a distinguished professor in global change. It's a distinguished professor and heads the Global Change Institute at University of Witwatersrand, popularly known as WITS University in Joburg, South Africa. Professor Vogel is a climatologist by training and has undertaken research in climate change, climate vulnerability and adaptation with a particular focus on disaster risk reduction and climate variability. She is one of the key contributors to the writing of the Green and White Paper of South African Disaster Management and was a major contributing author for the Disaster Management Act. She was one of the lead authors of the African chapter for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, popularly known as IPCC, Fourth Assessment Report, and was also an author of the Center's report for policymakers of the Fourth IPCC Assessment Report. As part of the large team, together with Al Gore, they received the Nobel Peace Prize. Coleen was a chapter author of Human Security for the Fifth IPCC Assessment Report, and she is involved in various international global environmental activities. She has been the chair and vice chair of several international communities, including the International Human Dimensions Program, now known together with other international programs as Future Earth. She has received an international award, the Bertoni Award, for her work on climate change, advocacy, and science for global environment change and sustainability. Climate change is a broader context and adaptation and risk reduction, focusing climate change in a broader context, adaptation and disaster risk reduction, focusing particularly on the interaction between fiscal and social dimensions shaping change. She's very keen to build links and collaborations with others. Please keep that in mind. She's very keen to build links and collaborations with others, particularly in sustainability and transdisciplinary science. Coleen is currently project lead of the City of Johannesburg Adaptation and Climate Change. Passionate about youth development, she is very involved in mentoring students, both undergraduate and postgraduate. Coleen is also undertaking research into transdisciplinary research approaches in various African contexts. We are very privileged to have amongst us such a distinguished person and professor to tell us a bit about what she has dubbed Stories from Africa, the interplay of climate science, action, and implications for development. Colleagues, let's listen to this piece. Thank you. Coleen.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Hello?
Yes,
Can you hear me? You can hear me, right? Okay, I'll just get back then to my first slide, and I hope you can see the slides. Thank you all very, very much for this wonderful opportunity. Just to set the record straight, I don't direct the institute where I work. I'm actually a follower. Our director is Francois Engelbrecht. But yes, I would like to share with you some of the stories from the South, the interplay of climate science, action, and the implications for development. We all know that we're living in an interconnected world. The challenges are urgent and they're extremely complex. Scientists alone won't be able to do this. We actually need varying perspectives, narratives, stories, and values from a range of other actors. And this is the theme that I'd like to thread through as the golden thread in what I'm going to be talking about. So firstly, the climate story. I start with that because that really sets in some ways one part of the narrative that I'd like to unfold with you. Africa, no matter which IPCC assessment you look at, is projected to be one of the most at-risk continents, both because of the sensitivity and exposure, but also because we're coming off a fairly low base in terms of adaptation, although there's growing amounts of work on adaptation that is happening. If you look at these maps, you can see as we project going into the future, the African hotspot, in particular where I live, Southern Africa, is quite clearly delineated. This heat brings with it issues of heat waves, days of warming, differences in seasonality, which have implications for livelihoods, etc. Coupled to that, we have the difficult issue of trying to also look at the projections of rainfall. And unfortunately, for many of us living in the Southern African area and environment, you can see again, areas projected for where rainfall will be diminishing over time. But included in that is issues of El Niño Southern Oscillation, which we have to keep an eye on, in particularly issues of variability that are coupled into and intertwined with climate change. As you can see here, periods of flooding and increased precipitation are also on the cards for many of us in the African context. Here you see a flash flood that occurred in 2016. There was loss of life, there was damage to infrastructure. And more recently, we've had the big KZN, KwaZulu-Natal flooding, which occurred on the eastern side of the country, where many were actually impacted. About 400 people died, unfortunately. 40,000 went missing, 4,000 houses were destroyed, and multiple infrastructures were impacted. And this all still going on in the area where we've just recently had a massive tornado. But obviously trying to attribute flooding to only the climate change issue wouldn't be the right way to go. We also need to look at the developmental issues, how we are doing on service delivery, infrastructure development, and how we are maintaining those. And these all then intertwine into the climate change story. So other contexts also matter. I don't think I need in front of this audience to remind you all about the issues of vulnerability, both household, individual, and collective vulnerability, which needs to be swept up into any assessment of loss and damage. But unfortunately, one of the take-homes from this narrative is that we have very limited statistics that we can really use when we come to the loss and damage debate. And hence we need to be doing a lot more on community-based adaptation, which I'm sure many of you or some of you in the room might be working on. And as I indicated, the issues of urban intersectionality of the risks, the issues of whether we are increasing our maintenance on storm infrastructures, how we are actually working with the precarious and issues of precarity, particularly in complex informal settlements, all compound to make this quite a messy and complex narrative, particularly when you are focusing on climate change. So what climate change and variability in essence does is unveil all these things that are going on every day in these situations. So to talk of things like tipping points, which some of us are grappling with, I think think is really problematic, and rather we need to be looking at events and processes and making sure we distinguish between those two. So just to pause before I will move on to the next story, future climate change in Southern Africa is quite an issue for us. Southern Africa is warming drastically over the interior regions. The rate of warming is in the order of twice the global rate of the continents that are actually experiencing similar situations. The region is likely to become generally drier, but rainfall futures are obviously uncertain in some areas. When we have a water-stressed area and a warm, dry region such as Southern Africa, we have options for adaptation, but these are limited. And we also have to keep an eye on variability, in particular El Nino, where we may then, with coupled into the suite of issues that create the story or this narrative, may expect heat waves of unprecedented intensity. And we also have then the periods of extreme rainfall that could butt up against some of these issues. But in essence, that's only one part of the story. And the message I'd like to leave you today is not really rocket science, but I think it is something that is increasingly important as we navigate into the Anthropocene and into the future. Whose narrative actually counts? As you can see in this slide, and I've been working more now increasingly in issues of knowledge co-production, and it would be very interesting to hear from the audience their experience of knowledge co-production. It's a very popular buzzword at the moment. But what it normally does do is it reveals many of the historical power dynamics and biases some knowledge over others. For example, if you look at the right-hand side of this diagram, on my side, it might be on your left, depending on your position in the audience, you can see that we've got various knowledge streams, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and traditional knowledge that need to be woven together with issues such as the social sciences, the physical sciences, and the technical sciences. And again, I'm sure you've heard quite a lot about this at the moment as you've been sitting here in these audiences for this conference. So the issue is not necessarily only interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, which is the mixing of our scientific endeavors, but it's really about going outside the walls of the university. What many of us, unfortunately, I think, see as transdisciplinarity is a throwing of our science over the wall and then engaging with various actors to come into that knowledge, if you like, co-production space. But it is starting to get traction, as you can see here. Many of the larger organizations and consortia of scientists are trying to bring in the policy community, the science funders, the research community, the business community, and wider science to actually implement actions together and to integrate the available knowledge. But the key concern is who is setting the agenda? What role do the funders actually play in setting us down on a path of sustainability and when we're seeking issues for the Anthropocene? So what I'd like to now do is to have a look at how some of us have been working in the space of trying to make knowledge integration in the field. And what we've learned, I was fortunate to be part of a team working from the University of Cape Town, where we worked with a number of different African colleagues. And some of these might sound very, if you like, basic, but unfortunately, they are really critical in the relationship building and in the pursuit of trying to get this narrative coming from actors that are outside of your domains of science and in particularly outside of the walls of the university. So relationships do really matter, and this takes time and unfortunately could, if you like, create delays as we move forward into the Anthropocene. We know we've got a closing window with climate change, as I've tried to show you, and how do we speed that process up, and indeed can we? So it's an iterative learning process. It's a process, not a project. And we need to embrace complexity with spirits of flexibility, humility, and creating the safe spaces that we all need. And then we need to be learning and reflecting on our processes. And I'll be talking about that in a minute. So the engagement principle is really critical. How you come to the table is important, and whether one can be flexible enough to make the detours and the recursive loops that you need in disciplinarity are really essential. Here is a slide that I've used from my colleague John van Breda, who works down in Stellenbosch, and you can see that the central part of the co-design process or creating this narrative with other actors is really the joint problem framing. How do you do the team building? And really starting not only from the science practice, which is the science problems, the contested knowledge spaces that we have there, the discourses, who's responsible for that, as I've already said, funders, universities, industrial research, but it also then the different methodologies that one uses. And that opens up a whole range of development practice that we've been using, PRA, all kinds of different processes. But the issue with society coming into that space really complicates the issue and provides for some very interesting debates and issues of concern. So we tried to create, and are still trying to create, a city story, a narrative of how climate change intersects with the multiple intersectionalities that I showed you. And you can see there we have a city that is dominated by very complicated governance processes. We have mayors that have been changing fairly regularly. That then has implications on the bureaucracy and who's responsible for the various issues on development. What we try to do, though, is to use a expansive learning cycle. As I showed you earlier, I think learning is really critical, how one can reflect and really do the multiple loops of engagement that you need when you are doing the learning. So we went into the city, they were working with us, we still are working with them, when they asked us to help them with a climate change strategy or a climate action plan. What we tried to do was follow the chat theory, which has been developed by Engstrom and others, where you question or try and surface some of the practices and wisdoms that are going on in that city. You try and have a look at the system in detail to reveal in particular some of the inner contradictions and how that then can play out in certain power relations. You try then to model a new functional relation, you examine and test that new model, and then you try and implement. And so what we then did was try and take that, if you like, framework and implement it and try and work with the city as we were going through the various processes. So we started with the questioning phase. We did historical document review. We did climate change laboratory work with various actors in the city. We did individual semi-structured interviews, all trying to get that narrative and that story coming from the actors rather than us going in and doing the development of surveys and engagements. We then did reflective laboratory work. So we fed back, or what the academics and others normally call the mirroring back. Is this what people are seeing in their case? And then we tried to go into creating some of the model phase. And we're currently working with the city to try and implement some of their work on their climate change adaptation process. So you can see we have gone through this process. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but the city have come to the table. Other cities are now following similar kinds of processes in Southern Africa and in fact in Africa. And it'll be really interesting to see to what extent cities can become, if you like, further capacitated to really surface their stories, because often this space is taken over by consultants as they move into the space. And unfortunately, they then become really just a form of creating an echo chamber rather than enabling the cities and the voices from those in the cities to be surfaced. So just to give you some physical or human sense of that, this expansive learning process, when I first began this work, I would start with the modeling to try and show people what was going to be experienced. But through this process, we actually started from the other side, in fact, working with the communities who we were engaging with, and started to work with the matters of concern, trying to surface what is coming from the city, all the constraints that they have with governance, the lack of championships, people who are actually working in these spaces, the lack of strategies, the lack of visions. And you can see here the engagement process that we had with a number of different sectors in the city, including water, transport, etc. We also tried to work on heat issues. This was, as you can see, a bit of an engagement on one of the sides where you can see some of us are laughing because the city had actually put into place in their integrated development plans that they were doing heat planning. But in fact, even to this day, I've just had a student following up on with the city officials. There is very little heat planning, even though it's mentioned in the IDP, there is nothing really happening on the ground. So there's this dissonance, if you like, in who's creating the stories, who are the actual actors involved, and how are they being enabled. As you can see, the matters of concern that came out from this process that we engaged with in the city was fairly interesting. And two major things that I'd like to just leave you with is this issue of the integration of what the cities are trying to do in terms of their development plans, and in particular their, if you like, governance structures in the city. So if you have a look there, their key performance activities are not aligned at all with climate change. They're busy working with other issues on development. So how does one foreground that concern and make or enable the climate change or other issues that you're wanting to work with in the development arena that you might be interested in? And then obviously this long-term strategic vision, because of the complications of the lack of sustained governance in the city of Johannesburg and other areas of concern that have been raised. So the engagement principles are really important in creating these stories with other actors, and it involves a learning process, particularly, and again, it might sound self-evident, but the humility of being able to go in and embrace complexity and uncertainty when one is trying to learn in these kinds of contexts. And it's not only in the urban context that this is happening. I'm very fortunate to work with colleagues from the University of Rhodes. We've been engaging in a number of social learning processes, in particular also trying to have a look at transgressive spaces where things are contradictory. And how does one surface that in ways that can be used constructively going forward? So their work, for example, you can adapt these kinds of approaches of chat theory and others into social contexts such as urban contexts. But there, obviously, the issues of culture, the way people are actually trying to resource their livelihoods, all those concerns take up time, but it requires this immersive process where you are actually working with rural communities. And I'm sure many of you are engaged in that kind of work and know what I'm talking about. So co-constructing and trying to cross-learn through the various barriers that might be there in terms of rainwater harvesting, in this case, trying to fit that in and then feed it back into colleges of education so that we have learning processes that may be sustained and create the next generation of scholars who could try and do this work. We now, more recently, are embarking on a green skilling process where we're trying to, with the University of Rhodes, look at social livelihoods, look at occupational theories and opportunities, in particular micro-credentialing linked into the university processes so that we can accredit younger scholars so that they can, what we call, learn to earn in some of these processes. So building on this, what are some of the reflections? I'm just going to quickly look back to the work that has been done in these spaces of co-design and co-learning when we're trying to create these stories with other actors, looking in particular at work that we did with Fractal and others in Cape Town. And these are not necessarily rocket science, but they are important in terms of these transdisciplinary processes. That there is no single plan or strategy that will take us through the Anthropocene. It's highly dynamic. It's a fragmented decision-making landscape. And how do you take these issues of multiplicity and the importance of the role of intermediaries and the importance of those who are doing issues such as coming in as consultants? How do they then blur the situation? Who are the brokers and the boundary agents that can help? And maybe we're needing to reconfigure some of the institutional arrangements that we have in these processes, as I've tried to show you in the city of Johannesburg. So we need to focus on these networks, these experimental sites where we're trying to develop these things, monitor as we go along, and then adjust. Taking these kinds of issues forward, many of us also working from the Rhodes University side and from various other universities, it has implications in how we train the next generation of scholars. And here you see things that might not normally be on a curriculum, things like co-knowing, co-listening and speaking, co-planning, co-influencing, and co-deciding. So how do you build that governance capacity so that you enable people to ask the kinds of questions that you're needing going forward into the Anthropocene as we go along into the very narrow windows that are now closing with various pressures that we are facing? So it does take time. It takes trust building. The actors are not always mandated to make the changes and may be voiceless. In the case of the city work, the project is constrained by key performance indicators, as I've indicated already, job descriptions, these tensions of wanting to profile certain issues as you come in yourself as an actor into the space, but they're not just detracting, if you like, from the mainstream. And then there are issues of levels of informality, public service delivery blockages, all these things. How can one move beyond those constraints? So my third issue that I'd like to put on the table is, how do we then create in this complex myriad of sets of relationships that are really difficult to untangle in a certain amount of time? How do we create a future story? I've been very fortunate to be working with young change agents who open up a very different space, in particular in the city of Johannesburg and elsewhere. And what really has been wonderful working with these young change agents is the new ways of seeing, the way that they bring different expertise, entrepreneurship, the arts, the creatives, and culture into other ways of knowing, in particular foregrounding things like tacit and local knowledge. So looking forward, how do we enhance this agency for change and for action? As I've indicated, I've been working with the South African Institute of International Affairs, working with a number of young people where we've been trying to capture and harness and work with them on creating their stories, their visions for their future stories that they'd like to take forward. We've actually embedded that into a policy process with the city of Johannesburg using these transdisciplinary approaches. And they've then rolled this out even into a national level. So they've been working both at the local level and then taking policy upwards into the system. What we've been trying to do in this process is co-design with the youth. We managed to work with this during the COVID times, in particular, bringing the city and youth players together, in particular on weekends, because many of them are studying. And so we had very strong engagement. And what was wonderful in this process is that this young people were actually writing in their own policy. So they created their own set of issues, that their story that they wanted to bring into the climate action process that we were working with formally with the city, so that they weren't just voices knocking at the door, but were actually having a seat at the table. And here you can see some of the young people that are engaged. It goes from young school children all the way up to adults, up to about the age of 30. So it's quite a large spectrum of youth that are engaged. So what they did, they wrote in their own young or youth climate action plan. They raised issues of systemic change, intersectionality, a just transition, leadership and advocacy, and in particular issues of accessibility and sustainability. And then what was the most, I think, exciting thing for me, and in particular as part of my career, was when they were invited to actually write the foreword from their work and then actually engage and put in their deliberations into the actual climate action plan, which is now sitting in the city of Johannesburg. I won't read that text for you because I've got quite a bit that I still want to share with you, but essentially putting in their various ideas that I've already shown you around intersectionality and so on. And so what came out of this, reflecting on what does it take to create these kinds of stories, which we often, I would argue, miss in our academic endeavors at the university, is issues like negotiation, empathy, listening, obviously critical and creative thinking we should be doing at the university, but time management, patience, problem solving, and this issue of rotational leadership as each of them took the seat with the city in negotiating what they go into that planning. So as I move towards the future, how do we now engage or imagine a future story? And many of us, I think, are starting to get involved in these future stories. How do you prompt people to think not just about a future that is perhaps out of reach, but actually try and envision preposterous scenarios, plausible scenarios, probable scenarios? How do you work with the cities of Johannesburg to move beyond just the next 5 to 10 years down the line into the future of what might be plausible and what might be possible? And there are some frameworks on this, and I'm sure some of you might be engaged in that. But one of the areas that, again, I've been working and been very privileged to work with is with artists. And I'm not sure how much space has been delegated to that in your conference. But people working in the transdisciplinary space have been trying to create this middle, if you like, zone where you have a mediating force, where you can enable a lot more of an open mind in terms of planning going forward. So we have the city of Johannesburg, the political, the social, historical, the individual. We've got our backgrounds that we bring to the table, the environmental, the economic, and the cosmic. But how do we enter and create a much more fecund, what we call a middle ground, by working with culture, art, religion, and spiritualities? This then takes us, I think, to the edge of where we can really start to create some very, very interesting stories, bringing in the synergies of different academic perspectives, but also local and tacit learning and knowledge. So I think some of you may have seen this before. Here we have the increasing socioeconomic well-being represented on the left-hand side, and then also the eco-centered work that we need. But it's these different approaches in terms of arts, different types of cultures coming into these mixes so that it's not just a policy or a bureaucratic exercise. So what do I mean? In the city of Johannesburg, what we then tried to do was actually work with the technology people on the right, or on my left, your right, my right and your left-hand side. You can see we worked with the city engineers who have a very technical background, trying to actually create an intervention to prevent flooding in the city. So this was an eco-seat that was developed where you would try and enhance and improve flood waters going into the system under the city of Johannesburg. But we worked with an artist, Haneli Kutsia, who's just recently qualified, using art experiences together with the technology people in the city to create this combined, of, if you like, fecund middle space. And there you can see the kind of layered co-design process that was done to try and bring in the artist's work, the artist's impressions, together with the engineers, so that we could actually start to envisage new approaches, new designs into the city. So very much a futures thinking, a way of thinking around how we can create some of these narratives. And then taking this out into the community through the education process as we started to engage with young children, working as they plotted and tried to understand how water plays a role in their lives going forward. But then as I start to wind up and to conclude, what about the personal story? What about each of our stories? And how do we bring those into the mix? And many of us are now trying to work on these, and in particular, the reflections of personal stories. So I've tried to map out the climate story. I've tried to show you the transdisciplinary story that can bring other actors into the space, in particular the city, the youth, and various artists and other forms working with technology in the city. But what about the personal story? So moving forward, how do we link the heart, the hand, and the mind for action? So where to next? One of the most interesting, I think, approaches is how do we foreground issues that are actually important, but often get slipped off the table because they aren't rigorously addressed. They might be addressed in a psychological sense, but they're not really addressed in terms of the personal concerns that might be faced by many people who are facing, if you like, the psychological dilemmas of what this complicated world is throwing at us in terms of climate change, COVID, etc. So the different types of knowledges that I think are required, and I'd love to hear more from some of you in the room, how do we bring these together, is the social, obviously the software, the types of things that we're trying to engage with as we make up these stories and try and represent people who don't have a voice in these stories. The hardware, as I've tried to show, how do we bring in the technical? But then also, more importantly, how do we bring in the hardware, the local and the tacit, which really is very difficult to surface in some of these power-ridden contexts. So the internal motivation, the long-term collective action, working with collectives in society where we can voice the issues and actually really do some rigorous analysis on that. The hardware, how do we bring in really critiques of AI, and how does that then unfold into the stories that we're trying to create going forward? And then finally, but most importantly, I believe, the software, the policy, the politics, the arts, the social media, and the young people who are trying to get these agendas off the ground. So as I conclude, there are 3 spheres of transformation that a colleague of mine, 2 colleagues, O'Brien and Signer, have put into the academic arena, mainly the practical, how behaviors and technical responses are important for creating these personal stories. Embedded into that are then analyzing the systems and the structures, and we were trying and still are trying to do that in the city of Johannesburg, and then bringing in beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms so that you can actually draw in the artists, the cultural dimensions. And then this plays out into what Danella Meadows many years ago tried to get us to think about, that ultimately we've got to start with these practical issues, as we've tried to do in some of the examples that I've tried to show you. Moving into the political, that abuts into that. How do the issues of power play out, the rules of the system? And we've seen that in some of our Johannesburg work. But ultimately, I think what Danella and others have said, the power to transcend these paradigms. How do we move into new ways of thinking, and in particular into the futures that we may need to take us into where we want to go in terms of sustainable development that is equitable, just, and fair. So to conclude, it might be a bit ironic that I end with The Economist for various reasons, which we could maybe discuss later, but humans have changed the way the world works. I've tried to show that in the various stories that I've tried to present to you, but now we have to change the way we think about it. And I hope the various vignettes or stories that I've tried to share with you try and perhaps give us some ideas of where we could go moving forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very, very interesting. I'll not want to say much for now, because we have another professor coming up to give some remarks about what has happened. Then we'll take all the questions. For those of you who joined later, my name is Emmanuel. I'm chairing the session. Whilst we get to that, a brief introduction. We have Professor Ross Comforth, Professor in Climate and Development and the Director of the Walker Institute, with us, going to give some remarks. I've been told not to give an elaborative introduction, so I'll cut it short. The African Climate Exchange, established by Professor Comforth in 2001, facilitated the interactions between academics, policymakers, practitioners in Africa. This emerged as an important boundary organization to identify how climate science can play a substantial role in reducing people's vulnerability to weather-related hazards in Africa. That's the brief introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome the Director of the Walker Institute, Professor Ross Comforth.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and thank you to the tech guy for his belt, because that will help me stay connected with you guys over the next 10 minutes. So, Coleen, thank you so much, and it's been brilliant to listen to you. There are some, I hope I can provide some useful comments and remarks on some of the things, the key stories that you've raised. It's very much part of the work that we do and the approach that we take. So I want to really pick up on 3 parts that you've raised, Coleen. And let's start with the idea of going outside the university. I think that's brilliant. Walker Institute, we're very much about how do we harness science to make a difference in people's real lives? How do we actually harness science to enable policy action, despite all the deep uncertainties that we see, which you have shown, Coleen? Climate change is about people, and it affects people in their places differently. That creates huge inequalities and unequal development. And to cope with that, we have a huge scale gap between the global climate projections, which Coleen showed near the beginning, and understanding people's local impacts, their vulnerability. You talked about the interconnectedness and economic governance, social impacts, they're all woven into this risk framework. And climate science at the moment doesn't really connect with vulnerability. It's a hugely missing and important part. So how do we bridge the global to local information scale? And how do we do that in a consistent way? That's really challenging. You talked about limited statistics. Vulnerability is about understanding how much income a household has to manage not just one shock, but one shock after another. I was really struck yesterday. I was talking to a colleague who we work very closely with in East Africa. And we've had a longitudinal study going on for the last 5 years in Uganda, and collecting detailed household information together with those communities. And just looking back from 2019 through to now at that data, just, low rainfall, locust invasions, COVID-19, impacts on market prices, just a catalogue where people who cannot even meet their own needs, it plunges people from transient food insecurity to chronic food insecurity. We have to be able to connect those local impacts and that knowledge with these climate projections and information. So how do we do that? And that takes you back to the point you raised, Coleen, about whose narrative counts. Whose story do we really need to hear? How do we hear that? I'm going to, as part of that, whose narrative counts, the World Meteorological Organization have actually launched a new lighthouse activity. And that new lighthouse activity, a lighthouse activity is by nature of the name, it's a lighthouse. It's to shine a light where there are really specific challenges in this world now. And that light is about understanding risk. The current approaches that we have to assessing risk are very top down. They don't capture that local vulnerability. Understanding, monitoring those long-term impacts of climate on people in the place that they live, and the difficulties that they face, and making sure that those voices are heard. So this lighthouse activity is called My Climate Risk. And that says it all. It's not just the climate risk, it's my climate risk. What's your climate risk? What's your climate risk? What's our climate risk? It puts the light straight down onto whose narrative counts. But in terms of how to bridge global to local, it's actually about how do we take robust quantitative frameworks, evidence-based, that by nature of that process, bring in that local expert, those local voices. And My Climate Risk is turning the world upside down, which is a great, great place to be. And it's about putting and making sure those local experts, local voices are there. They are determining. You talked about the matters of concern. It's their matters of concern, my matters of concern, your matters of concern. How do we really understand impacts that count? And the My Climate Risk approach is a new methodological approach that's robust, scientifically based, but by the development of the very framework, it actually makes sure that the local expert knowledge is front and center, and not just brought in for another workshop, not just brought in for a project, but is there for the long term. Because without it, actually, that science-led approach won't actually happen. It is all about how do you mainstream that bottom-up approach to risk going forwards. So it's encouraging to see that this initiative is taking place. There are now 8 different hubs in the world, including in South Africa, and we're all working together, sharing knowledge. And I think that was also a really important point that you made, Coleen. Those interweavings of different types of knowledge. There was a really interesting paper by Ted Shepard and Chi Huiyan Trong last month published, talking very much about those strands of knowledge, bringing together anthropology and climate science together. And that's a really important part as well in terms of interdisciplinarity. These different disciplines, different sectors cannot be separated. We bring, you talked about the creative arts and how important they are. We need to work together. My Climate Risk is an important framework for not only understanding impacts and on people in their lives now in the places they live, but also those future stories, and working together to explore, understand those matters of concern and developing those future stories together. It's very much an iterative process. You talked about the loops and building trust equity, building those relationships. Again, can only underline the import of that. And actually that goes back to being outside the university, because the nature of the relationships, the partnerships, where you're really, really enabling action, policy action that changes people's lives, requires us to work in a different way. We need to be, we can't just be project-based. We have to continue to nurture relationships and work together and learn from one another, actually. That's so very important. And certainly in the work that we're doing at Walker, that relationship, nurturing those relationships, enables us to actually really sit around and together at that policy table, because as well as doing the research, we all need to be part of the governance, part of the discussions that happen at policy levels, whether that's national, around the national adaptation planning, whether it's in regional and working within the international frameworks. But creating and building relationships is vital. I would just also like to, I'd actually written down, before I listened to all your talk, Coleen, about training for the next generation. I'm so glad you put that up there. You know, none of this is easy. It's actually one of the hard, I'm a meteorologist by training, and I find myself standing in front of this conference, but I wouldn't want it any other way. I'm not entirely sure now what my discipline is actually, but I just can only encourage working outside your comfort zone. Is hard, it's difficult. You have to have the confidence to say, I really can't understand what on earth you're saying, but tell me again, and I'm going to try a bit harder. It's about having the confidence and courage to listen and to talk and be outside your comfort zone. Working together is a hugely rich thing to do. There's nothing that excites me more than when you can bring together different disciplines and different sectors and start fusing those frameworks, those different intellectual frameworks, whatever. It is hard to do, but really, really fruitful and really important in this world where we have these complex interconnections that Coleen opened her talk with. So training for the next generation. How do we do that? What do we need to do? How do we nurture that transdisciplinary approach in people's thinking? How do we create the right structures to enable that to happen? How can we each personally, from what we've learned, help another person? You never know where those ripples then go, whether that's just through mentoring, for example, helping people to connect and helping to ground that next generation in local issues and the challenges that this world faces. So one thing, I think I'll close here. There are questions around bridging the global to local in a consistent way. How do we really do that? How do we really ensure that those local experts, those matters of concern are heard? How do we nurture that next generation? And I will close. I did do a TED talk a few years ago, and you'll see me variously change from my heels, which I'm wearing today, to a pair of very flat trainers. And I think that it was a bit of a gimmick, I agree, but it was really important because actually that was how I genuinely felt. We actually have to kick off our shoes and work in a different way. We have to walk in other people's shoes. And when I was in Uganda a few years ago, I work with an NGO, and their motto really stuck with me. And it was, and this refers to the humility you were talking about, the energy that we take into any situation, the right respect, the right intention, and humility. And this motto was, we should listen before we speak. We should learn before we do. And we should partner before we lead. And that has stuck with me ever since. And I hope that helps us to frame our own research and our own work going forwards. Let's focus on my climate risk and putting the local experts front and center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross. Thank you. I'll not say much till the end, but this is the time for us to all reflect and start asking questions and start putting our thoughts together. For those of us on the chat, I'll be reading out any questions that you would have. So start typing them in. This is where my duty now comes, so I'll stay here. Okay, I'll not sit here any longer. So please, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and
Thank you, Coleen, for the presentation. I also find it very difficult to speak after the motto that was just said. So I just want to ask you a question, given your insider experience. So what are your thoughts about knowledge creation in the IPCC, and especially in the creation of scenarios like the SSPs that underpin our climate models, as these scenarios are not really neutral, but have a lot of normative and sort of political messages within. So if you think that something will change and should change. So just your thoughts about that.
Do you want me to respond per question or?
yes, please. Sorry, Coleen. Yes, please go for it, please. Yes,
Right.
sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issues of normativity in these scenarios is something that is being grappled with all the time. I do think as we go through the IPCC and as we're starting to learn and engage more, in particular, as more actors come into the space, the urban, for example, efforts are really being foregrounded now in the IPCC. I do think that some of this will be deliberated on more and more and more. But yeah, I mean, I think there are these kinds of issues that need really serious, scientific engagement. I don't think you can throw out the one and replace with another, but we do need to start to think about this. But I think the next generation, as we go, in particular, since I did the IPCC, there's much, much more engagement. There's much, much more recognition of different ways of framing issues. Indigenous knowledge. I'm currently working in IPBES, for example, local knowledge, tacit knowledge, whose futures, how do people see things? Is it only the future thinking, or is it what about backward hindcasting, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm not really answering your question, unfortunately, but I do think there is an emergence that's starting to happen, and there is a recognition that we need to be really taking some of these deliberate, and then what it means for our science. I think that's going to be the interesting thing. How do you capture some of that? We've been doing a lot of work with local communities, engaging. How do we get the actor network theories and all of those kinds of things onto the table? So I do think there is a space, but unfortunately, I don't think the issue for me is that we're running against time. And so how do we get these things moving as fast as we can? I'm sorry if I'm not answering your question 100%. I think there is, this bringing the knowledge systems together and really understanding with experts who can help us tease out some of those concerns in the way we are shaping the future.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Yes. Let's go to the gentleman at the back, and then we'll come to you.
Hello, am I audible? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. So I was just wondering, since you worked in the Global South, much of the cities in the Global South are a product of the colonial rule, and they also have a lasting colonial legacy them. So if we are talking about a change about the future, I was wondering, what are the kind of structural transformations and the challenges that you face in terms of either first seeing them and then trying to solve them? Like, so how can we move away from an extractivist form of production to a more sustainable, renewable form of production? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very key issue. We are working with a number of colleagues who are trying to work on climate justice perspectives, creating those spaces, challenging ways that have been done in terms of how we measure, how we look at these problems. And so one of the things that I think is really required is to try and find safe, when I use the word safe, spaces where people can come together and put these transgressive agendas onto the table in a meaningful way. So South Africa at the moment has, for example, the commission that's been set up by the president. We have a just transition that's now rolling out. So there are a number of people who are seeing these issues and these concerns. Obviously, the colonial legacies of how we measure, how we reward, and then coming into, if you like, colonial modernity, how we still currently persist in some of those issues are very important. But I think there are spaces starting to unlock and open up. And people are starting to gather together in some of these spaces. And in particular, I think it's the youth who are pushing some of these agendas much, much harder. So to answer your question, it's a very difficult one. But I think there are people who are starting to really interrogate these. And that's why we need not only the transdisciplinary science, but the multidisciplinary science, the political scientists coming into the space to help us unearth these issues and these questions. So yeah, I mean, it's a very, very topical question. I wish I could say, it's A or B, but I think it's a messy space out there. But I do think there's action. If I look back over the last, say, 5, 6, 7 years, we're much more open to having these kinds of conversations than we were about 5, 6 years ago. And I think players like the big assessments, the global assessments, help us put that science onto the table, which then carries up into some of the bigger negotiation arenas. But it also needs to be supported by those who are out on the street, really trying to create some of those climate justice arenas. So yeah, civic society, action spaces, the youth, how those coalesce and come together in connection and start pushing and nudging and holding people accountable and responsible. My experience has shown that the way that the institutions are set up, which may be legacies of previous, obviously, development practice, and are very constraining. And so what kinds of institutions do we need? Do we need to throw out everything? Do we just need to tweak some of the things? And this is where I think many of us are now starting to work into this transformative space. What does that really look like? What does it mean, so that it's not just kumbaya kind of science? Let's bring everyone together and all hold hands. Because I don't think, that's not what we're saying. It's highly contradictory, these spaces. These spaces are very tense. They're politically skewed. There's a lot of power imbalances. And so trying to navigate around those is going to take, really deep and careful insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so there's been a few hands in the audience wanting to question. The gentleman here, we'll have a question from him, then I'll come on screen, then back on to the audience, then back on screen, and then we'll keep navigating that. So, this gentleman here. Yes, no.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Sam Poskett from the James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen. I think you largely answered my question in your response to the last question, but it was just going to be about how do you manage fundamental differences and disagreements in these kinds of interdisciplinary knowledge co-production spaces. I mean, if you think about COVID, there are still people who today are entirely convinced that it was a hoax. There are people who refuse to get vaccinated because they entirely believe that God will protect them. And then you have other people, not to say who's right and who's wrong, but you have other people who take a more scientific perspective. So how do you deal with those fundamental disagreements?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think just to answer your question is to actually surface those issues. I think in the past, what tended to happen is that one would go in blind as a scientist in many cases and push your agenda like a forecast that you're trying to, a projection that you're trying to make people desperately understand, because you know that they're going to possibly run into trouble with a shift in climate or a variation in climate. And I think those of us who are trying to work in these spaces, it honestly is really difficult. You do have to have time. You have to enable those things to be surfaced. There may well be contradictions that just permanently persist. But by having the dialogue, it sounds trite, but by having the conversation, at least you're starting to listen, you're starting to change your own perception on these issues. For example, even in the city, for example, they started to talk to themselves for the first time because they hadn't been talking to each other. So, it starts to open up the dialogue. And then from there, you can start to, as I said in this cultural historical activity theory approach, you then mirror back. And from there, you keep moving. But I absolutely, I don't think if anyone had solutions, we wouldn't be sitting with some of these complexities and some of these challenges. And that then goes to the issues of communication. I think we need to be thinking a lot more about how we're communicating these issues. And that's again where the role of the youth comes in. Just for example, one snippet of interest, when we were working with the city and still are working with the city, the youth put the issue of intersectionality onto the table. And one of the bureaucrats from the city said, "Professor, wow, that's a very fancy word that you put into the document, intersectionality." I said, "It wasn't me, that was the youth." And suddenly the city had to then have a bit of a lesson on what intersectionality meant. So it's the way we're communicating, the spaces that we are developing. But absolutely, I also stay awake at night trying to think of how do you not marginalize and block off people. And that's where I think the approaches from the arts, from the artists, having people see issues through different lenses. I think, unfortunately, what we do as scientists is we keep bringing it back to our safe space. We try and pull things back into the positivist, reductionist, perhaps, approaches that we use. And instead of trying to see how we can also take our perspectives and perhaps formulate them without losing the integrity and the credibility of the evidence that we're trying to put on the table. But yeah, a fundamental question, and I wish I could give you a snappy answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we come back to the audience here, so Natalie has put in the chat a question, and I'll read it out. And Coleen, please answer, and then Ross, please come in with supporting comments where possible. Historically, in development space, there has been a strong focus on policy development and much rigor in academic research. How do we bring the same appreciation of the importance of the softer skills to the way in which we work and focus on how we do this building agency stroke influence?
So again, also another tough question. I think it's shifting the paradigm that it's softer. I don't think the softer way of doing things is necessarily softer. I think that's the harder part. And that is why working with artists, so the artist that I've been working with, she actually interrogated a number of art pieces and then tried to distill out of them the various elements that could be useful in starting to broker discussions with various audiences. So she analyzed the artworks and she used them to actually start a conversation. And I think that's kind of the approach that we need. We need to be able to be saying that, this is not necessarily a soft skill, but that you can try and find ways to actually use the approaches that you're trying to develop with some credible either frameworks, some approaches, some methodologies, some paradigms of thinking, and that actually then distilling out from those some of the results that you can then carry forward. And there are journals that are starting to open up on this. So I do think there is a way. but it is going to be requiring hard work. I think the default is that we tend to go to the academics who we normally work with, which is fine and it's very useful, psychology, anthropology, etc. But it's actually also trying to work with people in these spaces outside the university who might have different ways of looking at things like that. So people like social media experts, entrepreneurs, you spoke about TED Talks, for example. How do we actually use these spaces and approaches to see whether we can start to generate some credible evidence? So yeah, I agree. It's a very tough question, but again, if I reflect back on my own experience, there's more acceptance now that these softer areas, these softer skills are now no longer soft, that they are really actually hard. And coupled to that is to really be thinking hard about leadership. What are the leadership elements that we need to now bringing onto the table and really trying to push into the university? Because, and unfortunately, I don't want to get into this debate, but it is something that I'm sure everyone talks about. It's the reward system. So, you know, the journals, the credits, the counting, the promotional criteria, etc. We need a large rethinking around how we are trying to train and generate and think about some of these issues. So again, sorry, I can't necessarily give you a nice magic bullet to say you do X, Y, and Z, and then that happens. But I do think there's open receptivity now for people who are trying to think about this really, really hard. Thank you.
Thank you. Ross, do you want to add to it, please?
Yeah, just a small amount. I mean, I completely endorse what you're saying, Coleen. I mean, we've used it when you're grappling with, it sounds right, the real world issues. You know, you need to use everything at your disposal, and every piece of the jigsaw puzzle is vital and important. I couldn't do anything now without bring in all those different elements, as well as those approaches, whether it's interactive theatre, whether it's working with the ballet group that we work with in Manchester to communicate and think about that engagement, and to bring people onto one page to surface those critical issues. We're all in it together. We need every area of domain expertise, which is, I'm not just talking about the academic disciplines here, and then using our experiential learning ourselves to nurture and train that next generation. We have the Walker Academy, the interdisciplinary training arm, which is a really live, responsive training where we're really working to bring up, really engage with our early career researchers, give them the opportunities to ground themselves in the issues and to see what we're learning from and doing, and the import of everybody, every piece in that jigsaw puzzle if we're going to make any progress at all. And just, even just, I say just, but being able to engage with evidence synthesis. That's a vital part in enabling action, thinking, using a systems-based approach. That all requires these different skills to come together. And we found that actually, although the students who've been through our evidence synthesis training, they've come out saying they've done a mini master's in just 2 weeks. But it shifts the dial for them. They then are approaching the work in a different way with a different mindset. So no easy answer, but just make sure that whatever we're all learning, we're sharing and giving people the next generation the opportunity to engage, because they want to be engaged. They want, as you've said, they want to be there. They want to be part of that conversation. So it is our responsibility and our privilege to be able to share and do what we learn with that generation.
Thank you, Ross. I am very conscious of time. I've seen 4 hands and I'm going to go first and first basis. I'll go for the first, but we still have time. We'll continue. But I'll go with our lady here, then I'll come to our gentleman here, our lady there, and then our gentleman there, and that will be me ending there. And if we have time, we'll take it. So let's start from here. Our lady just here. Yes. So this is based on countries.
Thank you. Margaret van Wessel, Wageningen University, the Netherlands. Well, thanks a lot for the great talk. Lots of talk about coming together, learning from each other, listening, This reminds me also of the whole idea of starting at the local level. I mean, there's a lot of embracement now of locally led adaptation, locally led adaptation principles, locally led solutions, but it also sounds rather problematic to me that we're not really going into the politics of this. We're burdening local populations to come up with their own solutions from their own resources, and we're celebrating those resources and all of that, and that's fantastic, local knowledge and all of that. But there's so much more going on than that. There's so much more that we need. There's so much more mobilization needed, and the politics of it are huge. And they're not just going about bridging local tensions. There's so much more that we're not talking about today. So I'd like to hear what you think of that. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And that's why I raised the just transition work that is going on in South Africa at the high, at the policy level. And that's starting to raise up a whole lot of issues. So I'm not trying to be naive here. And that's why I think I used the words kumbaya. It's not about just bringing people together so that we can have nice romantic stories that we can tell each other. I think these operations have to happen at different levels. We need to be interrogating at different levels. And I think that is starting to happen in South Africa at the moment as one example. But equally, I think in other continents and in other contexts, these things are happening. These spaces are not neutral. You can see, for example, at the COPs, we can spend days and days and days and still not come out with very simple and clearly delineated approaches. But I think what is happening is that there is much, much more recognition and power and acknowledgement about these power differentials and what that means. And then who do we hold responsible for the issues that we're taking forward? Where do big business fit in? Where does corporate come in? Where does greenwashing come in? All these issues that, as you're trying to, I think, imply, are absolutely essential. And you need different engagements for those kinds of processes. I don't necessarily work on the mitigation side where there's a whole range of these kinds of issues, but even in adaptation, are we going to be doing maladaptation by being naive around some of these questions? I think are absolutely important. And yeah, I would love to, have more discussion with you on some of these issues because they are fundamental. And thank you for raising them. We cannot be naive. And, I'm definitely very aware of this, even in the city, where it's a very fraught political landscape that changes constantly depending on, who's in power at the moment. When I say power, I use that in inverted commas. So yeah, absolutely. Very good point. And thank you for bringing it forward.
Thank you very much. Ross, do you want to add?
Yeah, I do actually, because it's an incredibly important and difficult place to be in space. And I don't want anyone to go away thinking that we're just doing a bit of research and whacking it out and going, okay, great, we've collected a bit of data, we're using it for our own gains. And, that it's just, we're working in the Middle East at the moment, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Iran, looking at water resource management across the Tigris-Euphrates basin. Couldn't be in a more difficult area. We're having conversations with Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran. Now that is a space where, nobody, that's a difficult place to be, taking science to support adaptation planning nationally, at governorate level, regionally. And we started in one place, which was all the political systems could cope with, which was a top-down approach to here is our understanding of risk. Here are some high-level adaptations that you might want to think about in terms of those national adaptation plans. And that's the only place we could start, because that was, with all the geopolitical sensitivities, that was where the door was slightly open. That wasn't where we wanted to be. We wanted to be working with the governorates, with the different communities, making sure that their understanding, their matters of concern, the adaptations they wanted, the adaptations that they could manage, because there's great assumptions about adaptation, but there are clear limits in what people can do and can take forward and want to do. But we had to start here where the door was a little bit open because of the geopolitical sensitivities there. But by staying with it, doing the hardest part, listening carefully, bringing in gentle ideas, different ways of approaches, the doors got open a little bit more. We were able to go to another level down. We're now at the point where we're working a lot lower, better, and enabling that understanding in terms of adaptation limits coming back up to the national table to inform that national-led planning, because what people at a national level in the ministries think about and understand about adaptation planning is very different from where people are. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of careful work, and a lot of robust science and all sorts of different techniques to enable that communication and people to be in the right place and to work across those levels. And we're doing that, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, but we're not shying away from it. And we definitely want to make sure that there is that join up. But nothing is fixed in a moment. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort and engagement all the time, working at the COPs, working at the country levels, working at the local level to help wherever we can to join up conversations and ensure the right people are able to make the choices they want to make.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could just quickly come in here. I think it's also being very aware of the activists who one can work with, so that the agendas are not being constantly just retweaked and re-embedded, but actually doing some of this transgressive thinking. And that's what some of us are also trying to work on now, going back to the previous question that was raised by the lady from Wageningen. Yeah. So it's again, who you're having the story building narratives with.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, Coleen. Thank you. Terry Cannon from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. My comments really are for us in the room and for DSA more generally, rather than a question to you, but you will obviously have your own thoughts about it. It relates to Margit's question also that you just commented on about power relationships. And you mentioned corporations and power almost as if they're just another factor rather than overriding the whole thing. And your final slide was the quote from the Economist, which was 2012. And I think the language of it is very interesting because it says humans have changed the way the world works. Now they have to change the way they think about it too. And you were slightly cynical about it, and I think you're rightly cynical about it. And if we joined this up with yesterday's plenary by Jason Moore, he would have said this is a classic piece of basically a magazine that supports the top 10%, if not the top 1%, hiving off responsibility for what their models do. And I think relating to that, we have to understand, for example, we could look at any country, but climate change is not the biggest problem that poor people face in South Africa. 40%, the poorest 40% have only 77% of the income, and the top 1% have 55% of the income. And that is the corporate power that what Jason yesterday would have called the bourgeoisie. That's what we have to be examining, is how systems of power make income inequality in South Africa getting worse. And that is the context in which people face climate change. Our projects are a drop in the ocean compared with the way in which those who have power want that power to be enriched themselves.
Absolutely. And I deliberately put that slide in and then made the cynical comment, hoping that someone like yourself would pick up on this. So thank you very much for picking up on it. No, absolutely. And I think that's what we're struggling with in the just transition discussion at the moment. What does it mean in terms of coal-fired, you know, the coal industry, the energy industry, which is, you know, very politically embedded into issues, the gas coming in, et cetera, et cetera. And then what does that mean in terms of those working on the ground? And that's why I raised the point just immediately after my response to the previous question, working with the activists, really trying to shift and understand some of these issues of power. And so there's quite a lot of work now where labor groups are coming in, the political parties are coming in as well, and really starting to have discussions that are quite serious around these issues. So yes, absolutely, I'm not shying away, and I 100% agree with the assessment that you've just made. You know, we can't just, as I say, duck and dive and just make it look as if adaptation and these kinds of responses are happening in neutral landscapes. They're not at all. And, you know, much of my work has actually been trying to show and highlight some of these divisions, but it's very, very clear in the spaces that we're working with in the city around some of those concerns. Absolutely. No, and unfortunately I missed the presentation yesterday, which I'm sure addressed these things in a much more nuanced and finessed way. But yes, I agree with the assessment that you've just made. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we continue to take the next question from the audience, let me just follow my protocol. There's a statement here. So Camilla makes a comment in the chat. I'm wondering if it is useful to ask people what their climate problems are. Perhaps the environmental problems are more complex, and by already suggesting problems are climate related, we may bury ourselves from better understanding environmental processes on the ground. There are issues I myself am concerned about in my broader research on the politics of climate knowledge production, particularly how donors and capitalist actors can promote age-old interventions as adaptation solutions. And there's a link there as well. So please, by all means, put your comments in as well. But we'll take the question from here, and then a last question, and then I'll sum up and call another colleague in, and then that'll be it for now, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Coleen, for an enlightening talk. I'm Catherine Haynes. I'm slightly unusual. I'm studying a master's at Reading University, but I've spent 23 years in the corporate world, working for Thames Water, who are in the news at the moment for all the wrong reasons. I was in finance, and it's sort of been hinted at in Terry's question and Margit's question, but it really seems to me that the banks, the financiers, are not at the table. And I'm just kind of wondering, in your community engagement, you know, are you trying to reach out to those people, because they need to be part of the decision making and understand that full cost? So yeah, thank you.
Yes, so we do interact with them, mostly at different levels. So we've got groups who are coming at it more from the climate activist perspective, and they interact in quite an interesting way with these various actors, in particular the business community. There's also a national business initiative which has ongoing discussions around these concerns. So there are these spaces where we do come into talking with them. And yeah, so I think there are, again, these different levels, but I would actually also just caution by saying it's quite useful to also be in the universities that we're operating in. You know, where does the activism end, and where does, you know, the science of what you're trying to do actually start? And so, yeah, we are spending quite a lot of time trying to engage in a meaningful way in these processes. But I myself personally I'm not working directly in the space with you know, the ESG and those kinds of I leave that to others who are working in that space more effectively, I think, that I can. So yeah, absolutely, that is a sector that should be there, and I think Terry's made his point quite clearly, and I agree with, are fundamental in the whole conversation. And yeah, finding ways to effectively engage with them is really important, so that it can be meaningful in a just way in terms of the just transition that we're trying to effect in the country as well, and in other places.
Thank you. Ross, do you want to?
Yeah, I will just add that it's certainly in the last 18 months been a new area of engagement for us. Because we recognize, I mean, not that import around finance and access, and but also that scalability piece. You know, we're not going to do that on our own. We're just little pilots and working with the governments. You know, actually corporates have got to be part of that discussion and around the table. But again, as I talked about earlier, having a door slightly open so that conversations can begin, and so that awareness on all sides is raised, and yeah, it is essential. So we are working with well, building relationships now with some of the banks, and indeed with some of the big corporates who are responsible for supply chains, for example, and indeed actually in the work that we do around storylines, climate, environment, livelihood storylines, there's a really important aspect there where we're integrating and thinking about the socioeconomics. So again, how do we go from the banks and their concerns around at the macroeconomic scale, when we've been working in the micro scale, and we're having lots of fascinating conversations which will lead to additional pieces in the frameworks we work in, which are connecting micro to meso to macro and back down again in terms of economics, because that is a really important part of the robust and evidence base that we are bringing to the table collectively as a multi-sector, multidisciplinary group of people.
Thank you very much, Ross. Before we go on the last point, I just want to say as chair that DSA has done very well in pioneering this, bringing in an economist on the first day to be a discussant, bringing in a physicist to chair the session, and other members of different fraternity coming in to engage with the process. So well done on you. I just want to leave you with the Ghanaian adage before I call the president in. And literally, I wouldn't want to use the local dialect, otherwise all of you will run away. I need you to stay. But literally saying that if one tree stands on its own, when the wind blows, it breaks so easily. It takes other banks of trees to enable it withstand the wind that is blowing. And that's the knowledge element, the training that's being channeled through this morning from 9:30, Coleen's speech, through Ross's speech, through colleagues sharing their input here. Just remember that one tree standing alone will break so easily. We need to train. We need to keep sharing. If you really want to hear the Ghanaian adage in the local dialect, see me during refreshment. On this note, I want to invite the president to come in.
Thanks, Emmanuel. There's a few Ghanaians here who would have probably appreciated it in the right. So thanks, Emmanuel. Thanks everyone for a great session. I just wanted to, this isn't the end of the conference. Please don't go galloping off to the train station or anywhere else before the end. We have two more parallel sessions to come with some great papers within. We have the AGM at 1 to 2. And I'll be saying a few things there about the DSA, where we are, where we want to go as the outgoing president of the DSA, served for 3 years. But I think now is the best, probably the time where we've got most people together, so it makes sense to say a few words of thanks to the people who've made these nearly 3 days still going possible. The first shout is to the conference conveners. So this is the 4th time I read this morning that we've had the DSA annual conference in Reading. The last one was 2006. I'm way too young. I wasn't here for that particular event, but I'm pretty sure this has surpassed all previous efforts that have been held here. It's been superb. The choice of plenary speakers, the contrast between them, having the critical thinking, bringing in natural science is not something we've really done a good job of within the DSA in the past. So that's really distinctive, as Emmanuel suggested, contribution that Reading has made, and we can hopefully continue with that. So can you please put your hands together for Alex? Please do stand up. Alex Arnold and colleagues Mike Goodman, Sam Rawlings and Sophie Blackburn, if you're in, give us a wave. Thank you very much. Superb job. The team waiting outside of the so the true heroes of every DSA conference are, of course, and many other conferences for that matter, are, of course, Nomad IT. And the team, go on. So there's a missing member. James isn't here, who does an awful lot for DSA. But nothing really works at all for the DSA with all of these conferences without these guys. And they're not only organizationally superb, they go the extra mile on the things that really matter, calling up the embassies, trying to make sure that the visas come through as far as possible on a one-to-one personal basis. They go well beyond what you would normally expect. They're also, actually, I noticed last night, probably the best dancers in the room, and create a social vibe around the place as well. So we couldn't do anything without these guys. So please. Thanks very much. DSA is all about creating a profile for development studies more broadly and creating a sense of community amongst ourselves here. That's not possible unless you've got somebody who's at the top of the development communications game. And we've been incredibly lucky this last year to have Rowena Harding. Could you come on? Who has driven up our presence on multiple platforms and given us a distinctive voice and relevance that we didn't used to have. So Rowena, thank you so much. Very impressive. Got a nagging feeling there's one. Oh yes, there is one more. Our plenary speakers and our sponsors. So many thanks, Cheryl and ODS for this session today, JDS for the Jason Moore session, and JID for J Mysteries session on the opening day. Again, we couldn't do these things without you, so many thanks, appreciated. So I think you've actually, that was on the list, very good point. So we've had, and barely any of them are here as well. Okay, student volunteers who on the tech front, on the getting around the place, so you were one as well. Excellent. So we get at least 3 in the room. So apologies. Student volunteers have been amazing. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. So we have time for tea and coffee. Please do stick with the sessions. Some great papers, and hope to see as many of you. All members obviously will be at the AGM, but if you're a wannabe member, please come along at 1 o'clock as well. Thanks.
And thank you very much. And a big thank you to you all for being very cooperative throughout the session. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to Coleen for all the wonderful response, the talk, everything. I'll see you in a couple of weeks. I'll come straight to your office when I visit WITS. So I'll come to see you. And thank you very much, Ross. Thank you.